Hey guys, tonight, settle in. Lower the lights, maybe put your phone face down because nothing important is happening there anyway. We are drifting back into the ancient world, into houses that looked calm from the outside and were anything but on the inside. Marble floors, painted walls, the gentle sound of a fountain. And behind all of that, a human system quietly running on exhaustion, obedience, and people who did not belong to themselves. Tonight, we are not in the fields. No blazing sun, no chains clanking across dirt. Instead, we are indoors. Kitchens, bedrooms, nurseries, libraries, bathhouses. The places where ancient elites ate, slept, studied, and aged. And the people who made all of that possible were the indoor slaves. The ones who lived close enough to hear secrets whispered at night. The ones who knew exactly how fragile power really was, because they were the ones holding it together. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let's ease into the strange, quiet reality of ancient slaves who worked indoors, not in the fields. In ancient societies like Rome, Greece, and parts of the Near East, indoor slaves were considered a luxury item. You did not just own one because you needed help. You owned them because you wanted convenience, status, and constant attention. If you were wealthy enough, your home was less a household and more a small ecosystem of human labor, all carefully ranked and constantly observed. And observation mattered. Indoor slaves were always being watched by the master, by the mistress, by other slaves hoping to rise one rung higher. Privacy was not a concept here. It was a rumor. Let's start in a Roman domus, because Rome perfected this system in a way that was both efficient and deeply uncomfortable. The front of the house was public. Clients came and went, politics happened, gossip flowed, and somewhere just out of sight, slaves were moving silently, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken, a cup refilled before it was empty, a cloak fetched before the chill was acknowledged. For indoor slaves, the day began before the household woke. Someone had to light the fires, someone had to sweep the floors, someone had to prepare breakfast that the master would complain about anyway. The goal was invisibility paired with perfection. You existed only when needed, and even then, barely. Household slaves often slept in corridors, storage rooms, or wherever there was space. Comfort was not the priority. Proximity was. You needed to be close enough to respond immediately if summoned. A bell, a shout, a sharp clap of hands. Your body learned to wake instantly because hesitation was noticed, and being noticed was dangerous. Unlike field slaves, indoor slaves were constantly evaluated, not just for productivity, but for demeanor, tone of voice, facial expression. Too cheerful and you were suspicious, too dull and you were useless. You had to balance right in the middle, which is exhausting when your entire life is borrowed time. Some indoor slaves worked in kitchens, which sounds straightforward until you remember that food was power. A cook held the health of the household in their hands, and everyone knew it. Poison was a constant fear among elites, so cooks were watched closely, tasted food, ate scraps to prove loyalty, trusted but never fully. If the master fell ill, the cook might be blamed. If a guest felt unwell, the cook might disappear quietly. Kitchens were not warm family spaces, they were pressure chambers with knives. Then there were personal attendants, slaves assigned to dress their owners, bathe them, shave them, and manage their appearance. These slaves saw everything: aging bodies, skin conditions, scars, weakness. They learned which movements caused pain, which moods meant danger. Imagine spending your life helping someone put on clothes while knowing they legally owned you, could sell you tomorrow, and might be dead next year. The intimacy did not create kindness, it created vulnerability, mostly for the slave. One category that deserves its own slow, uncomfortable pause is the slave child. Many indoor slaves were taken very young, either born into slavery or captured in war and absorbed into households. Wealthy Roman families preferred young slaves, easier to train, easier to shape, less memory of freedom. Some of these children became companions to elite children. They played together, studied together, slept in nearby rooms, and then one grew up to inherit everything, while the other remained property. The emotional whiplash of that situation is something ancient sources politely ignore. Tutors were also slaves too, educated Greeks teaching Roman boys philosophy, rhetoric, and mathematics. These men might be brilliant, well-read, respected for their knowledge, and still owned, still beaten, still sold if the mood shifted. The irony is gentle but constant. A slave could teach a future senator how to speak eloquently about liberty while having none themselves, and no one found that strange. That was just how the system worked. Female indoor slaves lived with a different kind of tension. Many were assigned as maids, hairdressers, or attendants to elite women. They learned beauty rituals, fashion, cosmetics, hairstyles so complex they required diagrams. These slaves were close to the mistress, but closeness did not mean safety. Female slaves were always sexually vulnerable to the master, to his sons, to guests. Roman law did not consider rape of a slave a crime against the person, only damage to property. If it harmed the owner's investment, it mattered. Otherwise, it was background noise.
Some mistresses took their jealousy out on the slaves rather than the men who abused them. Punishments could be petty or cruel, cutting hair short, assigning harder labor, public humiliation within the household. And yet, some female slaves navigated this space with careful intelligence. They gathered information, passed messages, became indispensable. Influence was possible, but it was fragile. One accusation could erase years of trust. Then there were the administrative slaves, account keepers, secretaries, estate managers. These slaves handled money, correspondence, and logistics. They knew which debts were unpaid, which bribes were sent quietly, which relatives were being cut out of wills. These slaves were valuable, sometimes too valuable. A master might free a loyal secretary after decades of service, or keep them enslaved precisely because they knew too much. Freedom was not always a reward. Sometimes it was a risk. Manumission, when it happened, was not clean. Freed slaves became clients, still obligated, still dependent, still socially marked. The house never fully let go of them. Emotionally, indoor slavery created a strange flattening of the self. You learned to compress your reactions. Joy was dangerous, anger was fatal, sadness was inconvenient. You became smooth on the outside, knotted on the inside. Ancient writers occasionally mention slaves who laughed too loudly or spoke too freely. These anecdotes usually end badly. The lesson was always the same: know your place, stay quiet, be useful. And yet, indoor slaves were deeply human. They formed friendships, romantic attachments, rivalries. They whispered at night. They remembered home languages. They told stories quietly while working when they could. Religion sometimes offered small comfort. Household shrines included slaves. Gods were for everyone, at least in theory. A prayer did not require legal status. As we drift through this world, it is tempting to look for heroes or villains, but the system itself was the main character. It shaped everyone inside it. Masters learned to depend on people they did not fully trust. Slaves learned to survive by reading moods like weather patterns. By the end of the day, when the household finally slept, indoor slaves did not rest in the way we imagine rest. They waited for the next call, the next demand, the next quiet crisis. Tomorrow would be the same: fires, floors, food, faces, and lives lived in service to other lives. And as we float gently onward, we will move closer to the bedrooms, the nurseries, and the most intimate spaces of all, the places where indoor slaves were not just workers, but emotional scaffolding for ancient elites who could not function without them. But we will take our time getting there. No rush. History is patient, and so were they. All right, let's drift back in. Same house, same quiet corridors. The lamps are lower now. The day has softened, and most of the important men of the household have gone off to be important somewhere else. This is the hour when the indoor slaves who mattered most to the emotional life of the house were fully at work. Tonight, we're easing into the nurseries and sick rooms, the places where crying happened, where fear lived, where people pretended they were indispensable, and the slaves actually were. In the ancient world, elite families had children constantly, and they lost children constantly. Infant mortality was not a tragedy so much as a statistical expectation. You named a baby, you hoped, and you tried not to get attached too fast, which is a strange emotional strategy when you lived in the same house as someone whose entire job was to care for that child every hour of the day. Wet nurses were among the most important indoor slaves in Roman and Greek households. Elite women often did not breastfeed, sometimes for health reasons, sometimes for social reasons, sometimes because it interfered with status, beauty, or fertility plans, so another woman did it instead. That woman was usually enslaved. Wet nurses lived extremely close to the children. They fed them, slept near them, rocked them through illness, whispered to them at night. They knew their cries, their moods, their tiny fears. In many cases, the child's strongest emotional bond in early life was not to a parent, but to a slave. Ancient writers noticed this, and they were vaguely uncomfortable about it. Some worried that a slave's character would influence the child, as if kindness, patience, and endurance were contagious traits that needed monitoring. Of course, they never worried about what it did to the nurse, because when a child died, the wet nurse still lived there, still walked the halls, still passed the empty cradle. Grief was not grounds for rest. Another child would come, or another household would buy her, or she would simply move on, carrying a quiet accumulation of losses no one asked about. These wet nurses raised multiple generations in the same family. Imagine nursing a woman who later gives birth to a child you will also nurse, a loop of care that never ends, only resets. Nurses and child attendants became disciplinarians. They enforced routines, taught manners, delivered mild punishments, and sometimes took the blame when a child misbehaved. Masters liked to think children were naturally noble. If something went wrong, it had to be the influence of a slave. As children grew, slave tutors and attendants took over. They walked them to lessons, helped them dress, cleaned up messes, managed emotions. Elite children were fragile things, overprotected, underprepared, and constantly watched. Slave attendants learned how to calm tantrums, redirect frustration, and absorb insults meant for others. A bored child with power is not a gentle creature, and a bored child with power over someone else is worse. Many indoor slaves became emotional buffers. They absorbed anger that would have escalated if directed at equals. They softened blows, both literal and figurative. They knew when to intervene and when to disappear. Sick rooms were another space where slaves became essential. Ancient medicine was slow, uncertain, and deeply unpleasant. Bleeding, purging, herbal concoctions that smelled of regret. When someone fell ill, the slaves handled everything. They cleaned vomit, changed linens, held bowls, sat through fevers, stayed awake through nights of delirium. If the patient survived, the slave was praised quietly. If the patient died, the slave was blamed quietly. Either way, they moved on.
Some slaves specialized as healers or medical assistants. They knew herbs, treatments, symptoms. Their knowledge was practical, learned through repetition. And like all slave knowledge, it belonged to the master. If a healer slave became too valuable, their life became smaller, restricted.
closely guarded. You do not let a walking pharmacy wander off. Emotionally, these roles created strange attachments. Slaves who nursed elites through illness sometimes became confidants. Weakness loosens tongues. People spoke freely when they thought they might die. A slave might hear regrets, confessions, fears, political anxieties, affairs, and then be expected to forget all of it by morning. Of course, they didn't. They remembered everything. They just learned never to acknowledge it. Female slaves working in women's quarters dealt with a different kind of emotional labor. Elite women often lived confined lives. Marriages were political. Love was optional. Loneliness was common. Slaves became companions, hairdressers, listeners, silent witnesses to frustration and boredom. They knew their mistress's moods better than her husband ever would. Some mistresses treated favored slaves with kindness, gifts, trust, occasional affection. Others oscillated unpredictably, kind one day, cruel the next. Power mixed with insecurity creates sharp edges. Pregnancy was a dangerous time. Slaves supported women through labor, miscarriage, and recovery. They cleaned blood, they held hands, they whispered encouragement, while standing just far enough away to remain invisible. If a woman died in childbirth, the slaves continued caring for the baby, and the household moved on, because it always did. Indoor slaves also handled death rituals, washing bodies, preparing funerals, mourning quietly while working. Grief was not something they were allowed to display loudly. Tears slowed productivity. And then there were the older slaves, the ones who had spent decades in the same household, their bodies tired, their reactions slower, their value measured more cautiously now. Some masters kept elderly indoor slaves out of habit or sentiment. Others sold them or reassigned them to less visible tasks. Old age was not a protected category. It was an inconvenience. The emotional toll of indoor slavery rarely appears in ancient records directly. Instead, it leaks out sideways, in jokes about lazy slaves, in laws about discipline, in moral essays reminding masters not to be cruel, which tells us cruelty was common enough to require reminders. What we do know is that indoor slaves lived intensely relational lives, constant interaction, constant adjustment, constant awareness of hierarchy. Their days were filled with faces, voices, and moods that were not their own. They learned to care deeply without attachment, or to attach and accept loss as routine. Either option required a kind of emotional discipline most free people never had to develop. And yet they laughed sometimes, quietly, in kitchens, in hallways, in shared moments when no one important was listening. Humor survived even here. It always does. As night settled, indoor slaves prepared beds they would never sleep in, tucked in children who would grow up to own others, closed doors they could not close on their own lives. And tomorrow, the cycle would continue. As we gently move forward, we'll slip into the libraries, offices, and accounting rooms, the places where knowledge lived, and where some slaves knew more about power than the people who wielded it. No rush, just float with it. History is still breathing. Let's ease back in. Same house, different rooms, quieter ones this time, fewer people, more paper, more silence. This is where voices lower automatically, not out of politeness, but out of habit, because this is where information lived, and information, as always, was dangerous. Tonight, we're drifting into the libraries, offices, and accounting rooms, the places where indoor slaves handled numbers, letters, and the delicate machinery of elite life. These were not the slaves people liked to picture. No sweat, no dirt, just minds constantly working while bodies remained legally invisible. In ancient Rome especially, educated slaves were everywhere. Many came from Greece or the eastern Mediterranean, captured in wars, sold through markets, rebranded as assets, and quietly inserted into households that depended on their intelligence while pretending it belonged to someone else. A household secretary might wake before dawn, not to light fires, but to prepare correspondence, letters dictated by the master, political favors requested politely, threats disguised as compliments, apologies written without sincerity. Every word mattered. The slave wrote it all, carefully, neatly, in the correct tone, and then sealed it with someone else's authority. These slaves learned how power spoke, how it hesitated, how it lied. They learned which phrases meant urgency and which meant indifference. They saw drafts torn up. They heard arguments before decisions were announced publicly. They were present for the private version of history, the unpolished one. Accountant slaves handled finances, estates, rents, debts. Slaves knew which farms were failing, which tenants were lying, which bribes were late. They tracked wealth in a world that liked to pretend it ran on honor. If money disappeared, the slave was blamed. If money increased, the master took credit. This was not a misunderstanding, it was policy. Some slaves managed entire properties while the owner was away. They hired workers, collected taxes, enforced discipline, and then stepped aside when the master returned, as if none of it had been their decision. These roles required trust, and trust in slavery is a strange thing. It is not mutual, it is conditional. It can be revoked instantly. An educated slave was always one bad rumor away from punishment. Knowing too much made you useful. It also made you dangerous. Roman law allowed torture of slaves as witnesses in court. The logic was simple and deeply revealing. Slaves, it was believed, could not be trusted to tell the truth unless they were in pain. So when legal cases involved elites, slaves were questioned under duress. Imagine being summoned not because you did something wrong, but because you were present, because you heard something, because you wrote something down. Knowledge did not protect you, it exposed you. Some educated slaves tried to remain deliberately dull, not incompetent, just unremarkable. Excellence attracted attention. Attention invited risk. The safest slave was the one who solved problems quietly and never appeared cleverer than necessary. Others leaned into indispensability. They made themselves impossible to replace, learned systems only they fully understood, managed networks of information that would collapse without them. This was a gamble. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it ended in paranoia. Manumission hovered like a distant promise. Freeing a slave was a sign of status and generosity. Some masters freed loyal secretaries after decades of service. These freedmen often continued doing the same work, now paid, now technically free, but still dependent. Freedom came with strings, obligations, expectations, gratitude that never expired. And freedom was not guaranteed safety. A freedman who knew too much was still vulnerable, socially marked, politically exposed, always one scandal away from being blamed as the convenient outsider. Inside the household, educated slaves interacted with others carefully. They were not field slaves, not kitchen staff, not fully trusted companions either. Their position was liminal, between classes, between worlds. They often supervised other slaves, which created resentment. Authority without freedom is a lonely place to stand. Some ancient writers mocked these slaves, called them arrogant, meddling, overeducated. It is easy to mock someone who threatens your sense of superiority simply by being competent. And yet, without them, the system stalled. Letters went unanswered, accounts unraveled, estates fell into chaos. The machinery of elite life required minds that slavery pretended not to value. Emotionally, this role demanded constant restraint. You listened without reacting. You remembered without acknowledging. You anticipated consequences without being allowed to warn anyone. You learned the art of quiet foresight, of seeing a disaster forming and stepping just far enough aside to survive it. At night, these slaves returned to the same narrow sleeping spaces as others. Knowledge did not buy comfort. It brought anxiety, because thoughts follow you into the dark. As the house slept, records remained, letters dried, numbers waited to be tallied again tomorrow. The slave's mind did not rest easily. It replayed conversations, recalculated risks, prepared for questions that might come suddenly. And when they did come, you answered calmly, always calmly. Because the most dangerous thing an educated slave could do was remind anyone that they were thinking. As we continue drifting, we'll move toward the dining rooms and social spaces, the places where performance mattered most, where indoor slaves became background scenery for elite leisure, and where mistakes were public. No urgency, just let the room change around you. History is very good at repeating itself quietly. All right, let's keep floating. Same house, but now the doors are opened wider, lamps are brighter, voices are louder, though still controlled. This is the part of the day the elites enjoyed most: food, wine, guests, performance. And for indoor slaves, this was when invisibility became a full-time skill. We've drifted into the dining rooms and reception spaces, the areas designed to impress outsiders. Marble tables, reclining couches, painted walls showing gods doing things that would get ordinary people in trouble. Everything here was meant to signal abundance, and abundance required labor, quiet, constant labor. Banquets in the ancient world were not casual affairs. They were social theater. Invitations were political. Seating arrangements were strategic. Conversation was competitive, but politely so. And through it all, slaves moved like shadows. Serving slaves were trained carefully: how to pour wine without spilling, how to approach from the correct side, how to avoid eye contact while still watching everything. A dropped cup was not just clumsiness, it was a public failure. And public failures were remembered.
During banquets, slaves became extensions of the furniture. Present, useful, replaceable. Guests commented on the food, the wine, the entertainment, rarely on the people serving it, unless something went wrong. Slaves learned to read rooms instantly: who was drunk, who was irritable, who liked jokes, who disliked being interrupted. These assessments happened constantly, subconsciously, because guessing wrong had consequences. Wine flowed freely for the guests, not for the slaves. A drunk slave was a liability. Control was everything. Entertainment slaves added another layer of complexity. Musicians, dancers, performers, sometimes children, sometimes foreigners deliberately chosen for their novelty. Their job was to create atmosphere, not attention, which is a delicate balance. Be impressive but not memorable, beautiful but not threatening, talented but never enough to overshadow the host. Some performers were highly trained, years of practice, mastery of instruments, perfected movements,
And yet, applause belonged to the master who owned them, not the person performing. Female entertainers were especially vulnerable. Dancing blurred into availability in the eyes of many guests. Consent was irrelevant. Status decided everything. After the guests left, slaves cleaned everything. Wine-stained floors, food scraps, broken cups, the debris of elite pleasure. The house returned to quiet only because someone made it quiet. Sometimes banquets ended badly. Arguments, insults, fights, drunken confessions. Slaves witnessed all of it and then pretended they hadn't. The next day, those same guests might pass each other in public as if nothing happened. The slaves remembered. They always did. Being present at elite social life meant absorbing hypocrisy daily. Public virtue, private indulgence, moral speeches followed by immoral behavior. None of this surprised slaves. They learned early that status rewrites rules. Some slaves used banquets to gather information, not actively, just by listening. Names, alliances, grievances, who disliked whom, who owed favors, knowledge accumulated quietly. Most of it could never be used, but knowing was still a form of power, even if it remained internal. The social spaces of the house were also where hierarchy among slaves became most visible. Senior attendants supervised juniors. Mistakes were noted. Favoritism played out subtly. Jealousy thrived here. A slave assigned to serve the master directly held prestige. Another relegated to cleaning afterward felt it sharply. These differences mattered because they affected treatment, opportunity, and survival. At night, after the last lamp was extinguished, slaves finally slowed down. Muscles ached, feet burned, throats were dry from silence. This was when they whispered about guests, about absurd behavior, about how powerful people often looked ridiculous up close. Humor softened the day, quietly. No one slept deeply. The house could wake at any moment. A guest who stayed too late, a master who felt unwell, a bell ringing unexpectedly. Tomorrow there might be another banquet, or none. Either way, preparation never stopped, because elite leisure required constant readiness. And as we drift onward, the spaces grow smaller again, more private. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, personal chambers, the spaces where elites stopped performing for society and started unraveling quietly. We'll go there next, slowly. There's no need to rush. Let's keep drifting. The noise from the banquet rooms has faded now. The lamps are dimmer. The house feels smaller somehow. This is the part of the building that visitors rarely saw and slaves never truly left. Bedrooms, dressing rooms, private chambers, the spaces where elites stopped performing for society and started unraveling quietly. For indoor slaves, this was the most delicate territory of all. Bedrooms were not intimate in the modern sense. They were crowded. Servants came and went constantly. Someone helped with clothing. Someone prepared the bed. Someone stayed nearby in case they were needed during the night. Privacy was a luxury even the wealthy rarely had, and slaves had none at all. Personal attendants learned routines down to the smallest detail. Which side of the bed the master preferred, how pillows were arranged, what temperature the room should feel like. These things mattered more than affection ever did. Evening routines were slow, ritualized, and oddly vulnerable. Slaves removed jewelry, sandals, and robes. They washed feet. They combed hair. They heard complaints about the day, about politics, about rivals, about spouses. This was when elites were most human and often least pleasant. Power relaxes in private, and it doesn't always look kind. Irritation surfaced easily. Small mistakes felt larger at night. A poorly folded garment, water that was too warm, a delay of a few seconds. Punishments rarely happened in public bedrooms, but tension did, and tension lingers longer than shouting. For many indoor slaves, especially women, nighttime carried constant risk. Masters felt entitled to bodies the way they felt entitled to furniture. Roman law did not question this. Society did not question this. Silence was the default. Some slaves learned to navigate this reality carefully, avoiding attention when possible, staying near others, maintaining usefulness that did not invite desire. None of these strategies were guaranteed.
Mistresses sometimes knew, sometimes didn't want to know, sometimes blamed the slave anyway. The household absorbed these dynamics quietly, like a structure built to hold stress without collapsing. Slaves assigned to sleep near children or masters did not truly sleep. They hovered between rest and alertness, listening for movement, for breathing changes, for calls in the dark. Night illnesses were especially dangerous: fever, pain, panic. Slaves stayed awake, holding bowls, fetching water, calling physicians who might or might not help. If someone died overnight, the slave was the first witness and the first suspect. Death in the bedroom shifted everything instantly. Slaves cleaned the body, closed the eyes, covered the face. They prepared the room for mourning while already anticipating blame, reassignment, or sale. Some indoor slaves spent decades in the same chambers, aging alongside their owners. They saw marriages sour, children grow distant, bodies weaken, minds falter. The slow Mistresses sometimes knew, sometimes didn't want to know, sometimes blamed the slave anyway. The household absorbed these dynamics quietly, like a structure built to hold stress without collapsing. Slaves assigned to sleep near children or masters did not truly sleep. They hovered between rest and alertness, listening for movement, for breathing changes, for calls in the dark. Night illnesses were especially dangerous: fever, pain, panic. Slaves stayed awake, holding bowls, fetching water, calling physicians who might or might not help. If someone died overnight, the slave was the first witness and the first suspect. Death in the bedroom shifted everything instantly. Slaves cleaned the body, closed the eyes, covered the face. They prepared the room for mourning while already anticipating blame, reassignment, or sale. Some indoor slaves spent decades in the same chambers, aging alongside their owners. They saw marriages sour, children grow distant, bodies weaken, minds falter. The slow unraveling of people who once seemed untouchable. Old masters could be fearful, suspicious, lonely. Slaves became caretakers, listeners, targets for frustration. Dementia, though unnamed, was not uncommon. Mood swings, confusion, repetition. The slave adapted, always adapting. Bedrooms were also where secrets lived, letters hidden, objects concealed, conversations overheard unintentionally. Slaves did not seek these things, they simply existed near them. And knowing secrets did not mean power, it meant restraint. Some slaves became emotionally attached to their owners over time, not out of loyalty to the system, but because humans form bonds even in uneven conditions. Care repeated daily becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes attachment. Attachment becomes complicated. When those owners died, the slave grieved quietly, or felt relief, or both. No reaction was officially correct. After death, slaves might be freed in wills, or redistributed, or sold, or kept by heirs who did not share the same habits or temperament. The room changed, the rules changed, the slave adjusted again. Bedrooms remind us that indoor slavery was not just labor, it was proximity, constant closeness to power,
weakness, desire, and decay. It required emotional control far beyond obedience. As night deepened, the house settled. Lamps dimmed, breathing slowed. Slaves remained alert, always alert, because even in sleep, the household depended on them. And as we continue onward, we'll begin to widen our focus to what happened over years, over lifetimes, to aging slaves, freed slaves, and the quiet ends of indoor lives that history rarely bothered to record. Just keep floating. We're nearly there. Let's stay slow. The house feels quieter now, not because there's less happening, but because we're looking at longer stretches of time, years instead of days, decades instead of routines. This is where indoor slavery loses its sharp edges and becomes something duller, heavier, and harder to see clearly. We're talking now about what happened when indoor slaves got old, or tired, or simply worn down by proximity. Ancient households were not designed for longevity among slaves. They were designed for usefulness, strength, alertness, adaptability, and all of those fade eventually, even in the quietest lives. An aging indoor slave did not suddenly stop working. There was no retirement age, no ceremonial moment when someone said, "You've done enough." Instead, tasks shifted gradually. Less lifting, less standing, more watching, more waiting. Some were moved to simpler roles, door attendants, messengers inside the house, watchers of children who were old enough not to need constant supervision. Their value was now experience rather than speed. Others were quietly sidelined, assigned to storage rooms, given repetitive, low-risk tasks, still present, less visible, still owned. Physical decline was dangerous. Slower reactions meant mistakes. Shaking hands meant spilled wine. Fading memory meant misheard instructions. None of these were moral failings, but they were treated like them anyway. Some masters kept elderly slaves out of habit. Familiarity creates a kind of inertia. You grow used to a face, a voice, a rhythm. Removing it feels disruptive, even if you don't particularly care about the person. Other masters saw old slaves as liabilities, medical costs, reduced productivity, unpredictability. These slaves were sold, abandoned, or freed without resources. Freedom in this case was not a gift, it was a dismissal. Manumission, when it happened earlier, changed things slightly. Freed indoor slaves often stayed close to their former households. They became clients, assistants, dependents. They lived in small apartments nearby. They continued the same work with a different legal label. Freedom did not erase hierarchy. It softened it, maybe, but dependence remained.
Freed slaves carried social marks that never faded, names that revealed their past, networks that limited them, expectations of gratitude that followed them everywhere. They were free, but not unobserved. Some indoor slaves never experienced freedom at all. They died where they lived, quietly, often without ceremony. Their bodies were prepared by other slaves, their belongings minimal, their absence filled quickly. Ancient records rarely note these deaths, a line item, if anything, a replacement purchased, the household continued. And yet, within the slave community, these deaths mattered. They were felt, remembered, talked about quietly. Stories were told, warnings passed on, names remembered long after official memory erased them. Indoor slaves built informal support systems, shared food, shared information, shared care during illness. When one of them declined, others compensated when possible. This was not organized resistance, it was survival. Emotionally, aging indoors meant watching generations pass. Children you cared for became adults.
then parents, then masters themselves. The house changed ownership, styles changed, faces changed. The slave remained. There is something uniquely exhausting about constancy in a world that never belongs to you. You adapt endlessly, but the direction is never yours. Some slaves took quiet pride in endurance, in knowing the house better than anyone else, in remembering how things used to be. Memory became a possession no one could take. Others grew numb, performed tasks mechanically, reduced emotional investment to preserve energy. This was not bitterness, it was conservation. At the very end, when work was no longer possible, outcomes varied. Some were cared for until death, some were freed too late to matter, some disappeared from the household one day and were never mentioned again. No speeches, no thanks, no recognition, just absence. And yet the house itself was shaped by them. Every routine, every habit, every unspoken rule had passed through enslaved hands at some point. The elites lived comfortably inside systems they did not fully understand because they never had to. As we slowly prepare to move on, it's worth sitting with that. Indoor slavery was not loud, not dramatic, not cinematic. It was quiet, relentless, intimate, and deeply human. The people who lived it did not leave monuments, but they left impressions in the rhythms of households, in the survival strategies passed down, in the quiet knowledge that power always depends on someone else staying awake. We'll continue one last time, gently widening out, to step back from the house entirely, to see what all of this meant in the long arc of ancient society, and how these quiet lives shaped worlds that preferred not to notice them. Just stay comfortable. We're almost done. Let's take one last slow step back, out of the bedrooms, past the corridors, beyond the front door of the house itself. The lamps are dim behind us now, and from the outside, everything looks calm again, respectable, ordered. Just another elite home in the ancient world, functioning exactly as it was meant to. Which, of course, was the point. Indoor slavery worked precisely because it was quiet, because it did not look like chains and fields and spectacle. It looked like service, routine, familiar faces doing familiar tasks day after day, year after year, and that made it easier to ignore, easier to accept, easier to forget. Ancient societies depended on this arrangement in ways they rarely admitted outright. Politics required time, philosophy required leisure, art required patrons, comfort required someone else handling discomfort. Indoor slaves made all of that possible. They cooked the meals that fueled debates about virtue. They taught children who would later argue about justice. They kept accounts that funded temples dedicated to mercy. The irony was not hidden, it was simply normal. When ancient writers praised the stability of their society, they were praising systems built on unseen labor. When they criticized decadence, they did so while being dressed, fed, and attended by enslaved people who embodied that decadence without benefiting from it. Indoor slaves blurred categories that elites liked to keep separate: educated but unfree, intimate but disposable, trusted but suspect, close enough to touch power, never allowed to hold it. And that tension shaped behavior on both sides. Masters learned habits of command early. Being obeyed became instinctive. Dependence on slaves became invisible. The idea of managing daily life alone became almost unimaginable. This softened elites in some ways and hardened them in others. Slaves, meanwhile, developed emotional skills that went largely unrecognized: reading people, anticipating needs, regulating reactions, navigating hierarchies without ever being at the top. These are not minor abilities, they are survival arts.
But survival does not equal freedom. And adaptability does not mean acceptance. Most indoor slaves did not rebel, not because they approved of their condition, but because rebellion inside a household was nearly impossible. Surveillance was constant, punishment was immediate, the risks were absolute. Resistance, when it happened, was quiet, withholding effort, slowing down just enough, passing information selectively, building alliances within the slave community. Small acts that preserved dignity rather than challenge the system head-on. And sometimes resistance was simply endurance, outlasting a cruel master, surviving to see ownership change, holding on to memory when identity was officially denied. What's striking looking back is how rarely ancient sources tried to imagine these inner lives. Slaves appear as types, as tools, as background figures. When emotions surface, they are usually framed as problems. And yet, the system itself betrays how deeply human these relationships were. Laws regulating punishment, essays urging kindness, warnings about overfamiliarity. None of these exist unless something complicated is already happening. Indoor slavery created a world of constant closeness without equality, a society where people lived inside each other's lives without sharing ownership of themselves. That kind of arrangement leaves marks, even when history refuses to record them clearly. As the ancient world slowly changed, slavery changed with it. Systems shifted, religions rose and fell, laws evolved, but the basic logic of invisible labor persisted in new forms, different names, similar dynamics. Which is perhaps the most unsettling part. Not that ancient societies relied on indoor slaves, but that they built entire moral frameworks while doing so, and saw no contradiction. So as we end tonight, there's no dramatic conclusion, no uprising, no sudden justice, just a quiet understanding. Behind every calm household in the ancient world was a network of people staying awake, staying useful, staying unnoticed, and history moved forward on their tired feet. If you're listening in the dark, that's okay. Let the quiet settle. Let the house finally rest. There's nothing else you need to do. Thanks for being here. Sleep well. Let's keep going. There's no reason to rush the ending. History rarely does. We've stepped outside one house, but the pattern repeats itself almost everywhere you look in the ancient world. Different walls, different languages, same quiet logic. So tonight, we'll drift a little wider, not to add drama, but to notice how familiar all of this already is. Because Rome was not unique, just particularly well documented. In ancient Greece, indoor slaves filled similar roles, though the language was softer about it. Household slaves cooked, cleaned, raised children, and managed daily life, while free citizens discussed philosophy and freedom in public spaces. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, relied heavily on enslaved labor. Indoor slaves ran households so citizens could attend assemblies. Some even worked for the state, maintaining records and assisting magistrates. Slaves enforcing the rules of freedom, because of course they were. Greek writers debated the nature of the soul, the meaning of virtue, the structure of an ideal society. Very few paused to ask whether people living inside those households might have interior lives worth considering. When they did, it was usually to reassure themselves that slavery was natural, necessary, helpful, which is a comforting belief when your comfort depends on it. In wealthy Greek homes, indoor slaves slept near their owners, managed finances, tutored children, and accompanied women who were largely confined indoors. Much like Rome, intimacy did not translate to equality. Familiarity did not erase ownership. In Egypt, the picture shifts slightly. Slavery existed, but household labor often blended into broader systems of servitude and obligation. Domestic workers could be enslaved, indentured, or bound by debt. Labels varied, dependency remained. Indoor workers in elite Egyptian homes managed food production, clothing, storage, and childcare.
Tomb art shows scenes of domestic life that look orderly and calm, which tells us exactly as much as Roman wall paintings do, that someone wanted it to look that way. Across the ancient Near East, palaces ran on human proximity: servants, attendants, scribes, eunuchs, nurses, people who lived inside power structures without owning any piece of them. Some rose high, most stayed quiet. And everywhere the same emotional pattern appears: close enough to see everything, too exposed to ever relax, too useful to fully trust, too human to be treated as such.
What's striking is how often ancient laws tried to manage relationships inside households. Rules about punishment, about testimony, about manumission, about inheritance. These were not abstract concerns. They were attempts to stabilize spaces where unequal intimacy created constant tension. Because indoor slavery was never just economic, it was psychological. It required people to interact daily across an unbridgeable gap, to eat food prepared by someone who could not leave, to trust children to someone who could be sold, to confide in someone whose silence was enforced by law. That kind of system demands emotional discipline from everyone involved. Masters learn to not think too hard about it. Slaves learn to think constantly. And those habits linger. When slavery declined in some regions, domestic service did not disappear. It changed names, changed rules, changed legal frameworks. But the expectation that some people exist to smooth the lives of others never really left. Servants, maids, attendants, caretakers, always nearby, often underpaid, emotionally present, socially invisible. The echoes are quiet, but they're there. Which is why indoor slavery feels unsettling even now, not because it was unusually cruel, but because it was so functional, so normalized, so deeply embedded in daily life that it stopped looking like violence and started looking like order. And order is seductive. As we settle into the final quiet, it's worth remembering that history is not only shaped by wars and rulers, it's shaped by routines, by people who wake early, stay late, listen carefully, and absorb the weight of other people's lives without recognition. Indoor slaves did not leave speeches behind. They left systems running. They left households intact. They left children raised, meals prepared, accounts balanced, nights survived. They left quietly. And now, so will we. If you're still awake, that's fine. If you're drifting off, that's even better. Let the house fade. Let the lamps go out one by one. Nothing else is required of you tonight. History has done enough talking. Sleep well.